Hi, I'm Kelly Hamlin from Wolf Gap, and I'm here at Traveler's Rest, and today we're demonstrating natural dyes. So that's dyeing textiles using a dye or a color that comes from plants. That's not something we usually choose to do today, or really usually don't have the option to do when it comes to the clothes you're going to wear and the colors that are on those clothes that you're going to wear. But historically, chemical dyes weren't an option. Chemical dyes were first invented around the 1850s. The first one was in 1856, and it was a purple color. And before that time, chemical dyes weren't an option. So instead, you use dyes that were derived from nature. So for most of human history, people have been coloring their textiles, whether that's silk or cotton or wool or linen. Those things have been colored using dyes that come from plants. Some of those plants could be grown in your own garden. Some of them could be collected from nature. And some of them were part of international trade and were expensive and had a lot of social status if you got to wear those colors. Natural colors come in every color of the rainbow, basically. Sometimes you just have to work a little bit harder to get the color you're looking for. And thinking historically, people didn't always have access to all of those colors. So we'll talk a little bit about some of that today. But first, the dyeing process hasn't actually changed that much over time. You still have a certain set of steps that you have to go through. Depending on what you're dyeing, you're generally going to be washing it first. Then you have to do a step called mordanting. And a mordant is actually a chemical additive that you introduce to whatever you're dyeing. Say I'm going to dye a silk handkerchief. I would simmer that silk handkerchief with a mordant that actually impacts the fibers of the silk so that they will accept a color more easily. So if you don't use a mordant first, then when you go to add color to a handkerchief, for example, the color won't be as bright and it won't last as long, and it's more likely to wash off of that handkerchief ultimately. And that's not what you want when you're dyeing something. So it takes a little bit of a knack, and historically, you might have your own recipe for a certain color that gets passed down from your grandmother, and you know you like that color, and that's the best way to get that color every time. But it might turn out a little bit different depending on what the season was like. If you say you're going to use black walnuts to make a nice rich brown color, that might not turn out as deep in a year that's been really wet, and the color might be more diluted in the nuts. Whereas if it's in a dry year, then the color might be more concentrated in the nuts. That's part of the beauty of dyeing using natural dyes. So you do the same steps, you mordant, you dye, and then you rinse. And you do that whether you're using natural dyes or chemical dyes. It just takes a little bit more experimentation when you're using natural dyes. The word mordant actually comes from a French verb, mordre, which is M-O-R-D-R-E, and that means to bite, because historically they thought that a mordant bit little holes into your fiber so that the color could soak into those holes more easily. We know now that's not exactly what's happening, but a mordant does actually alter the composition of fibers so that they can absorb a color more readily and in a more permanent way. So I use a mordant that is alum. So this is not the same as the alum you get at a grocery store for making pickles, for example. This is a different derivation of alum that is more like what chemists would use. You can also use tin or copper. Those are a little bit more hazardous. You can't just pour them down your sink when you're done, and alum is a little bit safer to use. So historically, people knew that clothes dyed with plants are more likely to fade in the sun or fade over the course of a summer, or if you're outside sweating and working in them. So that meant that's something you planned around. Maybe the first time you had a shirt, it was dyed yellow. Maybe it was a yellow like this, and you worked outside in the field for a whole summer and it faded until it was practically just tan or looked dirty all the time. Well, you could take that shirt again and mordant it again and dye it again. Maybe you dye it a second time and you make it a green or an orange, something that would lay over that original color a little bit. You wear that for a season until it gets faded by the sun and faded by sweat. Then you could dye it again, maybe a red or a blue or a brown, depending on the colors you started with. So that was just kind of a part of living in the world of natural dyes, is that they're not going to last forever, and that's just a part of it. That is one of the advantages of chemical dyes now that we use those in modern times, and once they were available in the second half of the 19th century, chemical dyes allowed you to have vivid colors that lasted longer. So that was a primary advantage, and they became pretty accessible pretty quickly to folks who had access to shops and places where you'd be able to buy a chemical dye. So natural dyes had their downsides like that. It took a lot to prepare. They fade in the sun. They fade if you sweat in them. But they also allowed you to have some creativity and engage with the natural world in a different way. So maybe it meant you had to keep your favorite clothes out of the sunlight of the window so that they didn't fade, but it also meant that you got to engage with customizing and making your clothes in a way that we don't always get to today. So the primary fibers, the primary textiles that were available to folks for dyeing would be cotton, linen, wool, or silk, and depending on the use that it was going to be going to, and depending on the accessibility of those items to a particular family, that's what would impact which fibers you ended up dyeing and making things out of. So I am today dyeing with silk, just for an example. Know that if you're going to be dyeing using alum as a mordant, that works very well with silk and with wool. It doesn't work as well with cotton or with linen. So after you've done that mordanting, then your next step is to make the dye bath. So whatever you're going to be dyeing with, whatever color you're going to be making, you're making that into a dye bath is what it's called. That's the colorful liquid that your fibers get put into. So say you're going to use onion skins, for example. You can make a lovely golden color with onion skins. You collect your dried dye stuffs, that's the word for the onion skins in this scenario, whatever the dye is made out of. Collect your dye stuffs, and you basically steep it in a pot with a relatively small amount of water, enough water to cover your dye stuffs and then some. Steep it for at least half an hour with just below simmering water. You don't want it to boil. If you bring it up too high, that heat will actually damage the color. And instead, you want to keep it just kind of simmering, just a little steam coming off of it for at least half an hour. Longer is usually better to get more color out of those items. Then you'll strain the solids out of it. So in my example, you would strain the onion skins out and you're left with a golden colored liquid in the case of onion skins, or whatever color you're making. You're left with just that color. The dye bath is left behind. Then you can add your fibers that have already been mordanted. It's okay if they're still wet. Add them into your dye bath and let them just below simmer in that dye bath for at least half an hour. Longer is better. And the longer you leave it in, the more intense that color is going to be. Generally, just like when you're making the dye bath, you don't want to let it come up to a boil or even a true simmer, or that will start to break down the color. So just steaming and still a pretty warm bath there. After you've let it take up the color to the level that you're looking for, like I said, at least half an hour, you take it out of the dye bath. It's usually best to wait to rinse it. If you can, wait until the next day, the next morning, for example. That gives it more time to really adhere into the fibers of whatever you're dyeing. And then you can rinse out, say, your handkerchief, for example, the next morning and let it dry, hang dry. Anything that has been dyed with natural dyes is best to hand wash and best to hang dry, not to apply extra heat like you would in a modern tumble dryer, because that breaks down the color more quickly. Now, even natural dyes, sometimes they came off of your own homestead. Sometimes they came out of your own garden, off of your own property. Sometimes they were things that you had to purchase in town if it wasn't something that was able to be sourced locally. So, for example, you can have onion skins, yellow onion skins, like I mentioned earlier, obviously can come from your own garden and your own kitchen. Or maybe you want a vivid red that generally was only available using goods that you might buy from a store like cochineal or Brazil wood. So those were things that were actually trade goods coming from across all corners of the world to bring color wherever, into Tennessee when you might not have a source of red otherwise. So a lot of families would have a mix of things that you could source yourself or things that you'd have to buy. And the colors that you had access to were indicators of your wealth to some extent, because if you could afford to purchase cochineal or things that were already dyed with cochineal, that was some extra expense. If you didn't have the money to do that, then you might be wearing something dyed with onion skins instead, or black walnut hulls, or Osage wood, something that was available locally. So we have Osage Orange, which is a tree that grows in this area pretty easily. You can see the wood is pretty yellow. This is the fruit of the same tree. So you may recognize this fruit falls from the trees. And you use the wood shavings to give you these nice colors, nice rich yellows when you make a dye bath with Osage. So this is something that would be pretty easily available. Here we have a silk handkerchief that's dyed with the Osage Orange wood dye. This really took up the color nicely. Silk and wool tend to take up colors really nice in a rich, deep way, and cotton and linen, you have to work a little bit harder to get a good color out of them. But this silk handkerchief has been in this Osage dye for a little while now. Usually it only takes about 30 minutes, and the longer you leave it in, the richer it gets, and this has taken up a really nice color. We also have black walnuts. Black walnuts are native to the Southeast, and the hull, the husk on the outside of the black walnut, makes an excellent dark brown dye. Here's black walnut on wool and on silk. Makes a really nice rich brown color on the wool. We also have onion skins, yellow onion skins, which we're all familiar with from our kitchens. Make a really nice golden dye. Here's onion skins on silk and on wool. It's kind of a coppery, and that's an easy one to try at home. The Cochineal Beetle was a way to get red that was pretty valuable in international trade in the 1700s and 1800s. These look like little seeds, but they're actually dried beetles. The Cochineal Beetle is native to Central America and South America and Mexico and lives on a cactus. And these beetles historically were farmed and traded internationally, particularly in the 1700s and 1800s, early 1800s, as a great way to get a rich scarlet red. It was one of the best ways to get a deep scarlet red color. While natural dyes might take a little bit more skill and a little bit more time, they're a little bit less predictable than the chemical dyes that we mostly use today. They also give us a new way of engaging with the clothes that we wear and engaging with nature. Now, historically, people probably didn't think about it that way. They didn't have any other option. This is the only way to customize your clothes. But this is still a fun way today for us to engage with the natural world and customize what we're wearing and think about what it took for people who lived before us to color their clothes. So I hope that you'll take some time to learn some about this, practice it in your own time at home with something like onion skins, and let it give you another perspective on the past. I'm Kelly Hamlin. I'm here at Historic Travelers Rest in Nashville. I'd like to thank them for the help in producing this video. I'm here from Wolf Gap. You can find out more about us at wolfgaptn.com.